welcome again to those people who have joined to the Environmental Impact Statement Scoping meeting of the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. My name is Brennan Staley. I'm with the Office of Planning and Community Development. I'm part of the Comprehensive Plan Update team. My role specifically is working on the Environmental Impact Statement and the growth strategy. I'm also joined by Michael Hubner from our office, who is the project manager for the update, and Patrice Carroll, who's the lead on policy, as well as our consultant team from Burt Consulting. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the meeting itself, and then we'll get into it. First of all, questions can be entered into the Q&A feature at any time. That's in the same bar with the chat and mute buttons as well. So feel free to contribute those questions at any time. If they're simple questions, they can be answered potentially by people who are monitoring it, but we're going to spend a lot of time at the end queuing up those questions and talking through them as well. If you have technical questions, any issues with seeing the slides, etc., they can be submitted through the chat feature. The chat feature is only visible to the host and the panelists, so it's not for the general, it's just for those technical questions. And lastly, this meeting will be recorded and posted on our website, so it will be available after the fact. So to start things off, I'm going to pass it over to Michael to give a little background on the comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Brennan. Oops, a little bit of an echo. Thank you, Brennan. Good evening, everybody who's taken time out of a beautiful summer evening to hear about the comprehensive plan and specifically our scoping for the EIS. I just want to say a couple of quick words here to ground this conversation in a larger project, which is updating this plan, which we're calling the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan Update. Our comprehensive plan is a vision for how the city grows and invests in communities over a 20-year time period. It's a policy plan that is informed by 4 core values: race and social equity, environmental stewardship, community, and economic opportunity and security. And those are still our guideposts for this work as we take a look at options for how the city may grow. Oh, I'm sorry, next slide, Brennan, please. Into the future. A major plan update like this one is something that the city does under a state framework established in the Growth Management Act. All cities that plan under the Growth Management Act have to have comprehensive plans and have to update them periodically. And our current plan, Seattle 2035, was completed in the middle of the last decade. A new plan is due by the end of 2024. And this plan will anticipate growth for the next 20 years after 2024. So out to the year 2044, and it will be crafted to be consistent with those state and regional policies. And this isn't the only exercise, the only process that the city is doing and inviting public participation regarding. There are other departments, they're doing short and long range planning. Most notably, this Department of Transportation is doing a Seattle Transportation Plan. Parks and Recreation, they'll be working on their park and open space plan. Public Utilities working on a Shaper Water, and our own department, the Office of Planning and Community Development, doing work around our industrial maritime areas and stationary planning around light rail. So this work for the comprehensive plan is coordinated with all of those other efforts so that we can take in your input and make sure that we're all operating from the same page going forward. I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Brennan, and he's going to drill down on the growth strategy alternatives and our EIS. But we look forward to getting input from you as we move forward with this project and update all of the plan elements. And there will be opportunities for additional community engagement and involvement in the coming months, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Michael. So the purpose of this meeting is to talk about the environmental impact statement that we're going to be preparing for the comprehensive plan, and specifically what we call scoping, that is developing the framework for how we propose to go about doing that work. An environmental impact statement, and often called an EIS, is an informational document that provides environmental information to be considered in the decision-making process. And it describes the existing conditions, the proposed actions and alternatives, which we'll talk about, proposed potential impacts that may occur, as well as potential mitigating measures to reduce or eliminate those adverse impacts. An EIS focuses primarily on identifying and avoiding adverse impacts, but it can identify potential beneficial outcomes as well. An EIS has multiple phases. The first is scoping, which is where we're in right now. This is an opportunity for the public to review and comment on the topics and the alternatives that are proposed to be analyzed. Our scoping period was originally a 30-day comment period, but has been extended to a 60-day comment period from June 23rd to August 22nd. And my apologies for not updating those dates. Once scoping is done, we will finalize the alternatives that we're proposing to analyze, and then we'll begin the preparation of a draft EIS. The draft EIS will have the initial analysis of the proposal and the alternatives, and we anticipate having that draft EIS in April of 2023. Once that becomes public, there will be a draft EIS comment period in which we'll solicit feedback on the draft EIS, as well as the plan itself. Then we will begin the process of preparing a final EIS, and that will include updating the draft EIS based on the comments that we received and adding analysis of a final preferred alternative that would be included in the final plan. And we anticipate that final EIS would be available in April of 2024 at the same time that the mayor's recommended plan and the zoning legislation would be available. So what are alternatives? Every comprehensive plan is required to identify and analyze different alternatives. Alternatives are different approaches to meeting the goals of a project that will be analyzed as part of the EIS. They should be distinct from each other to allow for meaningful comparison. They should represent a range of reasonable options, but although it's not possible to consider every possible option. And the alternative should represent bookends. That is a wide diverse variety of the possible situations we might want to include in the final plan, so that the final preferred alternative would fall within that range that is studied. And so again, we are going to be talking about draft alternatives, which we're looking for feedback on, with the idea that we then update them and start analysis of those alternatives. As Michael mentioned, the city is also working on a transportation plan. That Seattle Transportation Plan, the STP, will establish goals, strategies, and recommendations for a transportation system that works for our city now and in the future. So the STP also is required to do an EIS, and because we're developing these two plans, the comprehensive plan update and the transportation plan, at the same time, the EIS are going forward on a similar timeline as well, and they're being developed in coordination. The major difference is that the One Seattle plan will hold the transportation network constant and then vary the land use pattern to see the impacts that occur from that. That transportation network is basically what we have today, but with any changes that are already currently funded. So for example, the new railway stations that are part of ST3. At the same time, the STP EIS will hold the land use constant and vary the transportation network. And so between those two things, we'll be able to understand the impacts of a lot of different approaches. In addition to the EIS work, we'll also be doing a lot of work internally to look at the synergies and the interactions between those two things. And we'll be releasing obviously a draft plans that kind of look at how those things can work together, and final plans that look how those different systems can work together as well. In terms of the topics that we're analyzing, we are proposing to do a full EIS. In many EISs, they often decide that they do not need to look at certain issues or topics. That is not the case. We're looking at kind of the full range of things that are often part of EIS. Those include earth and water quality, air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, impacts to plants and animals, energy and natural resources, noise, land use patterns and urban form, historic resources, relationships to plans, policies, and regulations, population employment, housing and displacement, transportation, services, and utilities. I also want to note that on our website, we currently have a document called the Equity and Climate Metrics, which we're also looking for feedback. And those give a summary of the topics under equity and climate specifically want to do, but more importantly, specific metrics that we want to analyze as part of the EIS and as part of other work that's going to be going on. And so that's intended to give a kind of a much more fine-grained detail on what we want to do, specifically around equity and climate, as we are proposing to go kind of well beyond what is maybe has been the standard for EIS in the past. In terms of the alternatives that we're going to proposing to study in terms of the One Seattle Plan EIS, the city is obviously looking for, we have drafts that are out right now, we're looking for feedback on, and those alternatives are proposed to be different approaches to our growth strategy. And that is a fairly consistent thing for comprehensive plans across the state and has been Seattle's approach in the past. And specifically, it's worth noting that City Council has directed us that the alternatives need to study at least 3 things. One, adding new types of housing in neighborhood residential areas citywide. Neighborhood residential is a zone that currently allows only individual units on lots surrounded by yards. And second is looking at enhancing access to what they call 15-minute neighborhoods. Those are neighborhoods in which you can meet most of your everyday needs through a 15-minute walk or bike ride. And lastly, anti-displacement strategies. So Seattle's growth strategy is an element of the current comprehensive plan that contains the city's vision for how development should unfold over the next 20 years to accommodate expected population and job growth and to meet city goals. And that includes both the desired location of new development, but also how city regulations and investments can support and align with that expected development. The current growth strategy is called the Urban Village Strategy. It has been Seattle's growth strategy without major changes since 1994. It concentrates new housing and jobs in compact, walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods linked by transits. And those are areas that we have designated as urban centers, hub urban villages, and residential urban villages. On the right, you can see a map that shows the current growth strategy. And obviously the darkest blue areas are urban centers, and the lighter blue areas are hub and residential urban villages. It also focuses industrial development in manufacturing and industrial centers, which are shown in gray. This strategy has been very successful in concentrating new growth in those centers and villages. Over the last 10 years, 83% of new housing has been in an urban center and village. And that's created a really compact and transit-focused pattern. At the same time, there are a lot of growing concerns about that strategy. One, it does reinforce a pattern of segregation and exclusion because areas outside of the urban centers and villages are mostly limited to detached homes on large lots, which are very expensive. It means that much of the city is out of reach for low and moderate income households. It also restricts our housing supply and diversity, and those two things together exacerbates the displacement pressures on specific areas of the city that have seen a lot more change. It's also very important to note that all this is being done in the context of huge changes in the cost of housing. Over the past 10 years, the average cost of homes has doubled even after adjusting for inflation. So now the average cost of a home, including detached homes, condos, and townhouses, is just shy of $1 million, according to Zillow. Seattle also has persistent, longstanding racial disparities in homeownership. Of the non-Hispanic white population, about half own their home, but that number is only 23% for Black or African-American families. And those are discrepancies that have been there a long time. They are tied to housing discrimination that has been occurring for over a long period of time in Seattle. And the high cost of housing obviously makes it even more difficult to address those issues. As we update the growth strategy, there are a lot of different goals we are trying to meet, and we just want to briefly highlight some of those. We are required to meet regional requirements to plan for at least accommodating 170,000 jobs and 220,000 people over the next 25-year period. We are also want to increase housing supply, diversity, and affordability, and reduce displacement of both residences and businesses. We want to try and address that past and ongoing harms from housing discrimination and exclusionary zoning, foster neighborhoods where more people can walk or bike to local shops, services, and amenities, leverage investments in transit, especially the new light rail stations that are built and are going to be built, mitigate and address the impacts of climate change, and create livable communities. That is obviously a lot, but those are all things we really need to keep in mind as we think through both the growth strategy update in general, but also the environmental work we want to do to support that decision making. Now I'm going to move into the alternatives that we're proposing. And again, these are draft alternatives that we're looking for feedback on. There are 5 alternatives that I want to discuss. Each of these alternatives is focused primarily on housing, but also would have impacts in a job growth in the city. And also each of these largely build on the existing urban village strategy to look for new opportunities to expand that and allow new housing opportunities. In every EIS, the first alternative is always required to be a no action alternative. So we can study what would happen if we don't change. So the no action alternative would maintain the current status quo of focusing most housing and jobs within the existing urban centers and urban villages with no change to land use patterns. On the right, for each of the alternatives, you're going to see an illustrative map that shows what this pattern looks like generally. Under the no action alternative, that would mean the designated areas for growth under our growth strategy are primarily the urban centers in the dark blue and the urban villages in lighter blue. Obviously, outside of those areas, there is a diversity of zoning that exists. However, the majority of that is that neighborhood residential zone that only allows detached homes on large lots. So this approach would mean that new housing would continue to be primarily rental apartments concentrated in existing mixed-use areas. Most land outside of urban villages would remain limited to that high-cost detached houses. There would be no new strategies to increase housing supply or address exclusivity. And because we are required to plan for a minimum number of homes and jobs, we would assume that this alternative would meet that minimum, and it would assume 80,000 new homes and 132,000 new jobs over 20 years. For those of you who are following the numbers, that is the same number that we used in the previous slide, but it's been updated to remove housing that's already occurred over the first 3 years of that period from 2019 through 2021, and then to prorate it over 20 years. This is the only alternative that currently has a specific number of new homes and jobs that are anticipated. As we move towards alternatives, final alternatives, we'll need to add in those numbers. So that is also something we're looking for feedback on. You know, what are the right number of homes and jobs we should expect under the other alternatives? So from here, I'm going to move into the action alternatives. Alternative concept 2 is called focus. It would create additional areas of focus growth, including both new and expanded urban villages and or new smaller nodes that might have a similar feel to urban villages, but maybe at a lower intensity. If you look at the map on the right, you can see the existing urban villages and centers are there, but there's also a new urban village, an urban village that is larger, and then in the lightest blue, you can see these smaller nodes that might be added as well. This alternative is designed to increase opportunities to grow complete or 15-minute neighborhoods where more people can walk to everyday needs. It would create a greater range of housing options, but still primarily rental apartments, since it would be focused, concentrated growth, and near apartments and services in more neighborhoods. It would have a slight increase in at-home and commercial businesses due to the larger number of people living in Seattle. As I mentioned, none of these action alternatives are proposing substantial changes in jobs. We're not thinking that any of them would create new Amazons or new sectors, but as we would have more people living in Seattle, those people obviously would need more services. They would have their own maybe at-home businesses as well. And so because of that additional growth, there would be an increase in at-home and commercial businesses, and those would be probably still though focused in those existing urban centers, villages, and nodes. Alternative concept 3 is called broad. It would allow a wider range of low-scale housing options like triplexes and fourplexes across all neighborhood residential zones in the city. Again, on your right, you can see this would be a broad change. Obviously, there are areas outside of urban centers, villages that are zoned things other than neighborhood residential. Those would continue to have those designations, but within all the neighborhood residential zones outside of urban centers and villages, there would be that broad change to allow a wider variety of options. This one is designed to expand housing choices in all neighborhoods, but particularly home ownership options. Right now, there's few options for adding new homes in the neighborhood residential zones. And outside of that, most of the ownership is in townhouses. And this would help to create a wider range and really allow for new types of housing that we don't see a lot of today. It would also address the exclusionary nature of current zoning by creating more housing options in all neighborhoods, but especially options that tend to be lower cost than detached homes on large lots. It would also allow more housing options near existing large parks and other neighborhood amenities that are currently in neighborhood residential zones. And it would again have a slight increase in at-home and commercial businesses, although probably more spread out city due to the more spread out development pattern for housing. Alternative 4 is called corridor, sorry. It would allow a wider range of low-scale housing options, but only in areas near frequent transit and amenities. And you can see those corridors are shown on the left in the kind of the darker purple color. And these areas would continue to allow options like we talked about in concept 3, triplexes and fourplexes, but also might allow some other types of housing, potentially more dense types of plexes, but also maybe townhouses, small apartments. And this is designed really to expand the diversity of housing options, primarily near transit and amenities, and again, would have a slight increase in at-home and commercial business focused along those corridors. The last concept is alternative concept 5, which is called combined. It would accommodate a greater supply and diversity of housing across Seattle. The distribution of housing would be a combination of alternatives 2, 3, and 4, but resulting in more areas identified appropriate for housing and mixed-use development across the city. And as you can see, this one builds on the existing urban villages and centers, but then adds a new urban village, expands urban village, adds nodes, adds those corridors, but also a broad change to neighborhood residential zones outside of corridors. This is designed to promote abundant rental and ownership housing, primarily in areas that are well served by transit. It would address the past underproduction of housing and the rising housing costs that occurred because of that. It would support complete neighborhoods across more of the city, and it would have the largest increase in at-home and commercial businesses. And I want to point out that, again, as we talked about, one of the ideas is to have these different concepts represent bookends, so that whatever the final might be, it might fall within the boundaries of the things that we studied. And that to that end, alternative 2, alternative 1 and 2 kind of look at more focused patterns of development. Alternative 3 looks at a more broad pattern development, which really look at kind of distribution, and 5 looks at a lot more patterns. And so between those things, it will understand the impacts of kind of a wide variety of potential outcomes. I also want to point out that there is one area in which we are proposing to have a lot more detail, and that is because there's been a lot of work going on there to date. And those are the 130th and 145th station areas. which represent the area around the 130th light rail station, the 134th light rail station, as well as the 145th bus rapid transit station, which you can see on the map on the left. Again, we've been doing a lot of additional work in this area for many years, so the potential options are a little bit more clear. The alternatives here would coincide still with the 5 alternatives that we mentioned above. There would be a no action, and there would be one that looks at kind of nodes and corridors in these areas with heights as high as 75 feet, and one that actually looks at a new urban village at 130th, as well as nodes and corridors in other areas with heights as high as 95 feet. There will also be a separate meeting just about the 130th and 145th station areas on this Thursday, if you're interested in hearing more about that as well after this presentation as well. Additionally, one of the important things that we are trying to do as part of the comp plan update, but also the growth strategy specifically, is addressing displacement. We know that we can't address displacement without increasing housing supply, but also increasing housing supply is on its own insufficient for addressing displacement. So there's a number of things we're going to do as part of the EIS and afterwards to help address displacement. First, as we move from these draft alternatives we're talking about to final alternatives, we're going to craft all of them to consider higher levels of growth in areas of low displacement risk, while still increasing housing choice in high displacement risk areas across the city. As part of our mandatory housing affordability implementation, we did a lot of research and found that areas that actually grew and added more housing options actually did a better job of retaining people of color and low-income people, even after accounting for the rent and income restricted affordable housing in those areas. So we know it is important for those to continue to have more housing choices in those high displacement risk. But at the same time, we want to have the highest levels of growth in low displacement risk areas so that the rate of change does not overwhelm those high displacement risk communities. Additionally, the EIS will evaluate each alternative for its potential impacts on displacement so we can understand the potential outcomes that might happen for different strategies. And then the plan itself will support measures to address displacement beyond the growth strategy. As I mentioned, right now we have draft alternatives. We're looking for feedback on those. We're going to use that feedback to update them and create final alternatives. And those final alternatives will need to have a higher level of specificity on details. So we're also looking feedback on the locational criteria that we should be using to translate the draft alternatives that we have today into specific detailed maps. The list of a partial list of things that we think we should consider, which we'd like, again, feedback on in thinking of the location of these nodes and corridors we're talking about, is one, looking at areas, the access to frequent transit, especially the location of future light rail stations, but bus rapid transit as well, access to shops and services, existing or potential amenities like parks, libraries, community centers, and schools, displacement risk and other equity considerations, the location of environmentally sensitive areas such as creeks, wetlands, flood-prone areas, steep slopes, walkability, safety in the presence of sidewalks, air and noise pollution sources such as highways, major roads and industry, and topographical barriers such as highways and steep slope. The timeline going forward is, again, we released the initial concepts that we talked about today and began the EIS scoping process on June 23rd. There's a 60-day comment period that will go to August 22nd. We're looking for comments during that period on the proposed approach, the topics, the alternatives that we are considering, and especially making sure that not so much looking for which of the alternatives are the best, but rather, is our approach to environmental analysis correct, and are the alternatives the right ones to study? In September, we'll then refine the alternatives that we're going to use for analysis. And in October, we'll release a scoping report that explains both what we heard during this process, but also has the final alternatives with more detailed maps. Then we'll start the actual analysis, which would allow us to release a public draft of the EIS, the draft EIS, sorry, in April of 2023. We'll then have that comment period on the draft EIS, and then we'll have a public release of the final EIS, which again have a preferred growth alternative in April 2024. And again, that preferred growth alternative would be the growth strategy that would be represented in the final plan. And again, in translating the alternatives into a preferred alternative, we don't have to choose between any alternatives, but we are hoping that the alternatives that will be analyzed as part of the draft EIS will help provide environmental information that will help inform the decision-making around selecting a preferred growth alternative. So there are 3 ways to comment on the EIS and the scope and our approach to it. One, we have an engagement hub at engage.oneseattleplan.com. That is a place where you can learn, you can basically engage on a wide variety of topics and learn about events that are going on as part of this. And there's a specific opportunity there to post comments. You can also email myself at brennan.staley@seattle.gov with the EIS comment in the subject line, or you can mail me at the office as well. So that concludes the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we are going to use this time to answer questions. So please, if you have any questions, go into the Q&A button at the bottom and type them in, and then people will look at and put forward, and I will answer them, or Michael or Patrice, depending on the questions. Thank you.
Brennan, we have some questions regarding housing and alternatives. One question about alternatives and housing is a concern about what would be similar to, I think, the broad alternative, concern about changing family neighborhoods with a one-size-fits-all plan, and how can their neighborhood challenge the assumption built into the new plan and express their specific concern.
Great, thank you for the comment. So first, again, the work we're doing right now is just scoping the environmental analysis that we're proposing to do. The broad concept does include a kind of a one-size-fits-all change. The purpose of that, though, is to inform and the analysis to understand the impacts that change. That is not meant to be a proposal that would have to, if we want to do that, it has to be a one-size-fits-all. So I think, right now we're looking for feedbacks about, are these right alternatives? If you think that there's a different alternative that, is a different approach that we should analyze, that would be an appropriate kind of comment to have here. But then that conversation about what is the actual proposal that will be in the plan, that's going to be taking place over the next 2 years. And so I'd also encourage you to kind of be part of those conversations, since there's a huge amount of work between thinking through draft alternatives that we're going to analyze and actually getting to a final proposal, which could be much more detailed and specific and nuanced.
Thank you, Brennan. Another alternative related question is whether the city would change the MHA regulations to increase affordable housing near mass transit.
Yeah, so that is certainly a possibility. Again, that is not something we're proposing to analyze as part of the draft alternatives, but that is something that we could identify as kind of a proposal. So that is, I guess, one, thank you for the comment. That is something that we'll keep in mind. We have not, put forward a proposal to change them or not change them at this point. We're looking for more feedback on what we should do. I will also say that, as we consider changes to neighborhood residential zones, thinking about how housing affordability is baked into that is going to be a conversation we definitely want to have. When with MHA, we had a mandatory housing affordability implementation, we had the basic idea that when significant new capacity is added in the city, there would be an expectation that would come with some affordability requirement. As we change neighborhood residential, we want to have a conversation about that as well. And that could mean applying mandatory housing affordability to those neighborhood residential zones that have changes. It could be a voluntary program like Portland has done. Those are all questions that we want to have a conversation about as part of this process.
Brennan, if I could chime in with one, just to clarify one dimension of this, which is like as when MHA was originally adopted, the regulations that provide an option of on-site inclusion of affordable units versus the fee in lieu that could help to support affordable units on another site. But that provision is not part of the comprehensive plan. It wouldn't specifically be something that we've been including in the plan update. However, the conversation around growth and the growth alternatives could certainly, that the input is very welcome from the community about what regulations would be most appropriate to implement the plan, whatever shape it takes at the end of the day.
Thank you. A couple more housing / alternative questions, then we'll go to other topics. Another question is about whether alternative 5 studies mid-rise and high-rise zoning for existing hub and residential urban villages.
Yeah, so obviously a number of those already have mid-rise and high-rise zoning. So, but I guess the question I'm imagining is about the change. Would it include more of that? Right now, the alternatives don't have a kind of specific proposal for what that would look like. Basically the proposal is that we would continue to have types of housing that are consistent with the policies of urban centers and villages today, which generally do allow mid-rise housing across them, but tend to limit high-rise housing to urban centers. I will say that the alternative 5 does not posit currently that we would allow new high-rise zoning in areas like brand new areas that across the city. So that could be a comment. If people thought that was something they wanted, that would be the kind of thing you could put forward as a comment. So in summary, these are high level enough that they don't propose a specific kind of zoning or change, but overall it would continue to have it would continue the current approach of allowing a diversity of zoning, including mid-rise and high-rise in those areas.
And Brendan, I'll tag onto that one as well. So what we'll be studying in the EIS is the balance of how much housing and job growth we would be planning for in different areas, different types of centers or hub urban villages or residential urban villages. And again, as Brendan just said, not the specific zoning in those areas. If this concept implied in the question is about going taller in more of our urban villages, more into a high-rise scenario, and that means that those places would grow more, would have more of the city's homes and housing units and jobs in those areas, then that's something that would be something we would study. But the plan itself is not the same as the zoning that determines the building height. It's more about how much of the city's growth in different areas, and then the city does the work of adjusting the zoning to accommodate that growth where we need to make those adjustments.
And I'll just add, that's an excellent point, that in all these scenarios, the urban centers and villages would continue to have a substantial amount of growth in the city. But it is true that explicitly all of these, all the action scenario alternatives would posit the distribution of housing as a kind of a percentage of overall growth would be decreasing in the existing urban centers and villages, because we'd be adding new areas where growth could also occur.
Thank you. There's a related question about increasing capacity or floor area ratio for low rise, mid rise, and here's the additional part, neighborhood commercial zoning.
And I'm guessing the specific question is about whether we're proposing to do that or whether we could do that?
Whether we're studying the increasing of capacity for low rise, mid rise, and neighborhood commercial.
So these alternatives do not explicitly have a proposal for what zoning would look like in those areas, but certainly, those are things that we could consider as part of the comprehensive plan. And I'm having a hard time with so those are certainly things that could be possible, but we're not explicitly studying changes to specific zoning types as part of the alternatives.
Thank you.
Brennan, I hope this is okay, Misha. I hope we're a good tag team here. Again, I think the idea here for the comp plan or for these alternatives, you'll notice that as Brendan was describing the alternatives, he wasn't really talking about zoning very much. He did with respect to the neighborhood residential where we are looking at allowing different housing types. That was the only place where he's talking about specific zoning designations. Zoning is the tool, is the toolbox for implementing any of these growth strategies. So whether it be expanded urban villages, nodes, corridors, what we will do in the EIS is study different distributions of growth at different intensities in those areas. And then based on the results of that work, and as we move toward a preferred alternative, identify which zoning tools like neighborhood commercial or others would be most appropriate to achieve those outcomes. So first are the concepts, the locations, the relative intensity and amount of growth, and then looking at the zoning tools that can realize that.
Thank you. A couple more housing related items, then we'll switch to another topic. One is a concern about townhouse style development, limiting options for those with disabilities. Another is a concern as to whether alternative one is assuming new housing is rental apartments instead of condos.
Yeah, so on the first one, thank you for the comment. That is certainly a topic that we want to have a conversation about, not so much as part of the EIS, but as part of the comp plan broadly. Certainly these alternatives do look at allowing additional types of housing. And as you know, today, townhouses are the majority of the ownership options that we have today. And so this is proposing to look at adding new options. I think we've seen that probably still a lot of those would still be, multiple story buildings, as that is what most people want. But it could also include the opportunities for some small apartment buildings, like 3-story stacked flats, like you see in in Portland. They now see like sixplexes where there are one, each unit is one floor, and it's a home ownership option that we don't see in Seattle. So we are explicitly looking at alternatives that might allow for a greater range of housing, which could in part address that. But as we're saying, a lot of the tools, the zoning is going to be a conversation that will be kind of the second stage of this project. And sorry, there's a second question there I forgot already.
I think alternative one, assuming more rental instead of condo. Yeah.
So over the past 10 years, we've seen very little condo production. I don't remember the exact stats, but it's around 2% of units citywide have been condos, and those have been limited almost exclusively to downtown, with just a few, I think, a project or two in Capitol Hill and Ballard. That has to do with two things. One, the huge demand for smaller units. With the limited development we're seeing today, people are struggling just to supply the apartments, and so that has been the preferred thing to be able to build. The second is state rules that have substantially increased the cost of insuring condo projects and have long-term liability issues. And so for those two reasons, we have not been seeing very much condo to development. The only homeownership options that we're really seeing are predominantly, again, in the townhouse and area, and to some extent other ground-related housing. So we're certainly not, assuming that has to be apartments instead of condos. But the trends we see today is zoning for 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8-story buildings is going to be mostly apartment rental stock, just because of the conditions that exist today. And is certainly looking for different opportunities to try and increase condo production is another conversation that we could have, outside of the EIS.
Thank you.
Awesome. I have the next question, Brennan. We had a few questions regarding tree canopies as part of the EIS planning process, just acknowledging that how tree canopies will be preserved during and be considered during considering future planning processes. There's reference to a 2016 study on canopies, and particularly thinking through around planning and design, as well as ensuring to reach coverage targets as well. So wondering if you could speak to that.
Great. Yeah, so the city's last canopy cover study was in 2016. However, we're actually in the process of updating that with new data. And that will be better, not only because we'll have new data, but also it'll allow us to compare the change between 2016 and 2022. And we're going to, so that will provide us a lot of data about what's happening citywide, but we're also going to analyze that to look at what's happening in different areas, in different zones, and also specifically looking at parcels that have had a development activity over that period of time to understand the impacts on development. So all that data will then be used to basically look at to estimate the impact of canopy cover on each of the different scenarios. So basically looking at the land use patterns that are expected, and what has happened in different zones and on development parcels that have been developed. And so we'll use that actually to look at potential or likely estimate likely canopy cover for all the different alternatives. And then obviously we'll use that as well for the preferred alternative. In addition to that, obviously there's going to be a conversation about tree policy as part of the comprehensive plan. We have a number of policies on trees, part of the environment element. And then as we actually get into zoning regulations in late 2023, there obviously will be a conversation there about how do those regulations for landscaping and tree preservation interact to create the kind of communities we want to have.
Yeah, and Brandon, if I could add to that, I really want to elevate the last part that you said there too, which is we certainly have heard from the community. We've heard from City Council a real interest in the in how the comprehensive plan can be stronger in the area of tree canopy and protecting and growing our tree canopy over time. It is within the scope of what we're looking at in terms of our policy elements of the plan, separate and apart from the EIS. And what we hope is, because even in a no action scenario, we still have development, even within our neighborhood residential with larger buildings and larger footprint, and tree retention and tree canopy is going to be an issue in any scenario. And looking forward to having real data and results where we can identify ways the city can mitigate and plan for a future where we have a healthy tree canopy and can grow and accommodate new residents and all of the other goals that we're planning around. And this EIS is going to be very helpful in us doing that work in a very transparent way so that you all and others can see how these alternatives compare with each other.
Brennan and Michael, I apologize. I missed, there was an additional question regarding trees around exceptional trees. Was that something that you both covered in your answer already by chance, or could you just elaborate a little bit more on that as well? Yeah,
I mean, I think our development regulations look at, preservation of the small trees, preservation of exceptional trees, and the addition of new trees. And I think, all three of those would be things that would be considered as part of the that stage of having the zoning and development regulations in 2023.
Awesome. The next question is a two-parter. One is, are the slides available for folks to review? And will there be a greenhouse gas analysis for each plan? And which plan will help Seattle meet their 2030 climate goals?
Great. So on the first one, again, these presentations are all posted. And I guess we actually did not put the slides themselves online, but I'm certainly happy to do that. We can make those available. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, so one of the key parts of the environmental impact statement will be assessing the greenhouse gas emissions of impacts of different alternatives. The process for doing that is that first we are going to develop land use concepts, and which will kind of very specifically say where development is likely to happen over all the different scenarios or alternatives, and that will be based on past development techniques, or past growth, as well as the type of pattern that's expected by the changes that are proposed through alternative. Then we'll also be doing a transportation model, which will look at that land use pattern and then understand what that means in terms of trips. How many more trips would there be because of that? Where would those trips be? What mode would be? How long would they be? And that will then kind of create an output of between those two things. How many new buildings are we likely to have? What types of buildings? How many new trips do we have? What types of trips? And then we will use various existing modeling tools to convert that land use pattern into potential impacts on building energy use, electrical use, and solid waste as well, emissions from that as well. And we'll use the transportation to look at the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions from transit. And so then, so each of those scenarios will have explicit numbers for greenhouse gas emissions. Those numbers will be focused primarily on impacts within the city. They will not look at, because the EIS is meant to focus on the affected area, which is the city of Seattle. They'll be primarily about the change in the city, but there may be some opportunity kind of outside of the EIS to also kind of look broadly at what that means kind of at a regional level.
Brandon, I just want to technical. I think you misspoke in looking at not only the impacts of transit, but also private vehicle use as well.
Thank you. Yes, I meant
especially private vehicle use.
Yes. And also I'll just point out that the Seattle Transportation Plan is doing a lot of work looking at the impacts of specific transportation investments and what they would mean. And between those two things, we'll have a lot of information about how we can meet our goals. In terms of which of the alternatives would help meet our climate goals, obviously that is not an answer we have now. Right now, we're in the stage of understanding what different alternatives we want to analyze, and then we'll analyze those alternatives to get an answer. But certainly at a high level, we know that accommodating more people in areas like Seattle is a good climate change strategy. Accommodating more people near transit and shops and service is a good strategy. And so those are kind of principles that we have in mind that we will kind of look for the public's input on how to make that real as part of the comp plan process.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question is a clarifying question, but maybe we can talk more about it. As you know, planners, we love our acronyms, and so I was wondering if you explain what MHA is and have any comments and thoughts as part of the EIS process.
Thank you. So MHA stands for Mandatory Housing Affordability, and they are a set of requirements that apply to pretty much all land that's zone multifamily or commercial, or almost all land zone multifamily or commercial, that as part of new development, a new development has to contribute to housing affordability, either by setting aside a portion of the units on site as being rent and income restricted, or paying into a fund so that the city can then create those units. And that was implemented in, I want to say, 2018 or 19 for the first time in the city. And when it did that, it was two things together. We increased the capacity of those areas zones that were affected, and also put in place the affordability requirements. And the goal of those two things together was to ensure that we got more income restricted housing, affordable housing, but at the same time, we didn't substantially increase the cost of market rate housing, such that it would lead to overall price increases in other areas. And the idea, I think, in this context is that, as we consider change of the growth strategy, which then result in changes to zoning down the line, that we also are going to want to think about how that applies to that zoning proposal. Again, not as part of the EIS, but as part of the broad comprehensive plan update.
Thank you, Brennan. We're going to come back to housing and some neighborhood questions. One question is whether the housing proposed in the 5 alternatives, if they're all market rate, if there'll be some specification of different area median income levels or missing middle, different size units.
Yeah. So, as a city, we have a lot of different tools for creating housing. Obviously, one of them is that we kind of set the table by putting forward a growth strategy, which then would get implemented through zoning, which would say what kinds of housing can be built in what areas. We also, again, have tools like mandatory housing affordability, where we actually require that market rate development to create affordable housing through, again, put it on site or paying into a fund. And then obviously we have our own funding that we put forward to create affordable housing. So as we mentioned, the different alternatives would look at kind of different approaches to where we'd grow, and those would have implications for the types of housing. And then the types of housing obviously would have implications for the cost of that housing and whether it tends to be rental or ownership. So they'd all have kind of a major impact on the types of housing and the rates of that. And then obviously, the alternatives don't look at kind of different approaches to putting in forward a, approach to getting that affordable housing as part of market rate development. But that is something that we obviously want to have a conversation about as the comp plan generally. So maybe the alternatives don't propose different approaches to that, but that is a larger conversation that we are going to have as part of the comp plan to update generally about, what types of housing would we want to have, where do we want to have it, and then how can we guarantee affordability through things like MHA or other tools.
And Brennan, I would add to that, and I think you were pointing in this direction, but to be really clear, the EIS itself, the draft EIS, when analyzing a range of different approaches here, is going to produce estimates or projections of different housing outcomes, primarily in terms of the type and location of housing and generally what which household needs that housing would meet, be it ownership versus rental, large units versus smaller units, and with some analysis of likely affordability outcomes from that. There's a limitation in how much you can predict into 20 years into the future in terms of affordability outcomes, but we have a pretty good idea from past private market performance in the city, which types of housing are more affordable than others. And so we hope to learn a lot about how these different alternatives perform compared with each other. As Brennan said, we won't be, a significant, it's not a majority of the housing produced in the city, but the rent and income restricted housing is an important part of our housing stock. And one of the things that we also have in mind in looking at these alternatives is creating opportunities for non-market housing to be produced in different places in the city. And there's certainly some observations about the different alternatives in terms of access to neighborhoods and amenities and that complete neighborhood concept for some of the subsidized housing that the city or other nonprofit players can provide over time. And we know that's going to be a part of the housing picture going forward. The last thing I'll say is just to make it super clear about the difference between the alternatives in terms of the big picture of housing is that the alternatives will differ both in terms of the pattern of where housing would be envisioned in the future, but also the amount of housing that we would anticipate. And one of the things we hope to learn about in this analysis is what are the implications of accommodating less versus more housing within the city in terms of the ability to afford housing, to purchase housing, just to meet the needs of our employment growth that we know is going to continue as well. So all of those things are in play and will all be in the EIS.
There's a second part of the question that asks about whether the EIS will look at housing for people transitioning from homelessness, along with permanent supportive housing for those coping with addiction or mental health issues.
Brennan, I can take that one on. You've been talking a lot now. I'm going to guess your voice is getting a little tired. Correct me if I get this wrong, please. The EIS itself won't really get into the needs for the shelter or permanent supportive housing or other transitional housing for folks who are experiencing homeless. However, the comprehensive plan itself will and is now required due to a change in state law, which was adopted a couple of years ago. We're working closely with the state and with the county for the first time ever, to quantify the city's anticipated needs for permanent supportive housing and short-term shelter housing to meet what we anticipate, not only the needs of folks who are experiencing homeless now, but into the future. And that's something that all of the cities in the region are doing together, so that we are coordinating and working together to meet that regional need and the crisis around homelessness. So that's something in the plan, but not specifically analyzed in the EIS.
Thank you. A couple other housing cost-related items. Someone concerned that the city is unfairly saying the neighborhood is pushing or keeping lower income families out, but that it may be more about speculators that are contributing to that. Also, how to retain families in the city, such as through amenities with parks and schools and things like that.
Maybe I'll just thank you for that comment. And to say that we're not trying to say that individual people are pushing people out, but rather it's the institution of issues, the institutional issues of the amazingly high cost of housing. Again, the average detached home is now more than $1 million in Seattle, and that is not affordable to low and moderate income people. And so it is rather the housing costs that we are experiencing in the city mean that many areas of the city, as currently zoned and developed, are not affordable to low and moderate income people. Sorry, and the second half of the question was about what?
Oh, amenities to support families like schools and other things.
Yeah. So certainly the EIS will be looking at impacts to a variety of things, including utilities, needs for schools, et cetera. We're working very closely with the school district on both EIS and the comprehensive plan generally. I think that the conversation about where do we want new amenities is a really core part of the comprehensive plan. So that's a conversation we're having, more out of the EIS, but as part of the work we're doing. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we may be tying those two things together a little bit, which is one thing that we had in mind in crafting these alternatives, and I'll emphasize in saying this, it's unlikely that any of these alternatives in their sort of simplified form are going to be the preferred alternative at the end of the day, but these ideas of different ways we could grow into the future that we will study in the EIS, that we very much had in mind that there are many neighborhoods across the city where there are characteristics of those neighborhoods that people love and that people benefit from, be it neighborhood school, parks, commercial centers where they can walk and get a cup of coffee or their groceries, or walk to the post office or what have you, community centers. And the idea here is to study a range of ways that we can grow as a city into the future and provide more people the opportunity to enjoy those benefits, to enjoy those things that people love about those neighborhoods, but also retain them, retain those amenities into the future. But folks of different incomes, different races, people who work in the city, people that are downsizing from their current homes in the city can continue to live in those neighborhoods. So there's a real connection between those amenities and the kind of housing that we are trying on for size through this analysis, to really have a future where it's more inclusive of people enjoying their neighborhoods, enjoying all the good things that we have in our neighborhoods.
Thank you. One more similar to the MHA question. Will the EIS consider a policy allowing developers to buy their way out of creating housing for lower moderate income residents? And what effect would that have on concentrating housing in less desirable areas with fewer amenities?
Yeah, so again, the EIS alternatives do not have that level of detail about what our approach to getting housing affordability would be. That would be a conversation that would happen more as part of the comp plan generally and as part of developing zoning regulations. Certainly that is an issue that has gone back and forth, the ability to pay versus perform on site. The two important notes are, I think that it is certainly anything that's going to be applied to smaller developments, especially those in neighborhood residentials, is going to have a payment option. It's certainly just not feasible for a project that may only have 1 or 2 units to be required to perform. So I think any scenario for those smaller projects is going to continue to have performance option. And we as a city have kind of always desired a diversity of payment and performance. With performance, obviously you get those at the time that development is built, and in with market rate developments. With payment, you actually can get a lot more affordable housing in the same neighborhoods. And in fact, that payment allows the city to control where those units go, and often we're able to put those in, in places like that have much better transit than the average development, especially, perhaps, things like where townhouses might be located. We're able to put those in urban villages right near transit. So they both have their pros and cons. And certainly, I think that a payment option is going to be necessary in pretty much any scenario.
Awesome. Looks like I have the next couple questions. And so I'll combine these two together for you all. There's a question around considerations for new P patches throughout the city, and also around conservation districts, particularly regards to preserving neighborhood character. And so one question around P patch amenities, second around the potential of conservation districts to protect neighborhood character throughout the city.
Mm-hmm. So again, the EIS won't be explicitly looking at a desire or need for P patches. However, that is a topic that would be appropriate as part of the comprehensive plan update. In terms of neighborhood conservation districts, so this is not something that exists within the city today. There have been proposals to allow things that people might consider neighborhood conservation districts, which would make it more difficult to develop in certain areas where there are certain attributes. That is not something that is an explicit part of a proposal that we're proposing to study, but that certainly could be a topic that could be discussed as part of the comp plan generally. Great.
The next question is one around public infrastructure being taken into consideration. And so I was wondering, there's a question, alternatives requiring major changes in this infrastructure would have huge ranging environmental impacts, and how much analysis will be done to determine the impact of these systems for each of these alternatives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we will be, so obviously a core part of every environmental impact statement is looking at the impacts on the utilities, light, sewer, water, as well as the environmental impacts, to streams and creeks, et cetera. So that will be a core part of this work. I think we will be, in terms of utilities, we're going to work with the utilities to kind of follow their lead on how to go about doing that work. We certainly have been meeting already with City Light and public utilities to, to get their perspectives on things, and that is going to be informing the growth strategies themselves. Where would we consider developing sort of the alternatives in the growth strategy itself, as well as the EIS will also be looking at potential mitigating measures that may be necessary to address any potential impacts that could occur.
Yeah, Brendan, thanks for that. I really do want to emphasize that the comprehensive plan is an effort at the city that is not in a silo, isolated at the Office of Planning and Community Development. One of the, part of our mission as a relatively small office in a large city is to bring departments together around major initiatives, and comprehensive plan is first and foremost in those. So we are actively working with the other departments, not agencies like City Light, Seattle Public Utilities, Parks and Recreation, others, to partner in guiding this EIS and to together identify strategies that we need to adopt as a city as we grow, regardless of how and where we grow. There are going to be the kinds of impacts that we're talking about here, and really partnering with them to craft policies and to hear from the public about what impacts you want to make sure that we are attending to. Patrice Carroll, who's on the line with us here, is leading up that interdepartmental work. And Patrice, do you want to add anything to that? I think that's such an important point here.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we have a number of different ways that we work across departments. And in addition to reviewing all of the plans that those individual departments develop, a lot of times those will inform our policies. We coordinate around community engagement and other opportunities. But in terms of the EIS, there's a lot more that forms the plan than just the preferred alternative that represents the pattern of growth. There's hundreds of policies in the plan that also guide the development of new programs and investments. So you will have an opportunity later in the process to weigh in on some of those policies, which again, I think may address some of the issues that you're raising tonight that may not be addressed through an EIS process. So, and obviously we work with departments like the Office of Housing and has a lot of involvement in developing our housing policies.
Speaking of working with other departments, this next question is around transportation improvements, particularly around pedestrian and bike uses. There's been an example called out Northgate with the designated greenway not having many pedestrian facilities, even though there's been a relative increase in, I'm assuming, in car traffic. So I was wondering if there's, if you can speak to on creating more walkable neighborhoods and ensuring that pedestrian and cyclists and folks who don't use their car are safe.
Michael, do you want to take that, or?
Take myself off of mute and I'll take that question. Sure, that's a great question. I think that as I suspect that as Brennan was walking through the different alternatives, including the alternative, the focused alternative, where we're looking at new nodes or new or expanded urban villages, the concept of corridors, even the broad alternative where we're looking at potential new housing opportunities in different neighborhoods spread more generally across the city. Each of those is going to have implications for transportation needs for people to get around the city. And most of them, we believe, contribute to this idea of complete connected neighborhoods. It's one of the things that, this is a really interesting time to be working on a comprehensive plan coming out of the pandemic and all the lessons that we are continually learning about how important our neighborhoods are and things that are nearby. as through the lockdown and beyond, how we're using our public spaces, our right of way. And so in one way or another, a number of these alternatives are envisioning land use changes that really will, to be successful, are going to rely on us identifying at the neighborhood scale where we can and should do more to connect people to safely and easily walk or bike or get to transit to reach what they need every day. We're working closely with the Department of Transportation as they are working on that Seattle Transportation Plan that was described earlier. And one of the important pieces of that plan is going to be putting in place an approach to those neighborhood scale improvements that the success of this plan are going to rely on. We know that if you look across a map of the city, some neighborhoods have a lot of that infrastructure in place already. They have sidewalks or they're nearby separated bike lanes, or they have a lot of that in place, whereas others do not. And that's part of what our challenge here is, to identify and prioritize the neighborhoods that are going to need improvements, really to be successful in achieving the community outcomes, not just the land use, not just the housing that is envisioned with this plan.
Great. One last question on other topics. Will the EIS alternatives produce specific neighborhood maps showing recommended or proposed corridor, node, et cetera, locations for each neighborhood on a street by street level of detail?
Yeah, so essentially there are kind of 3 levels of increasing detail. Obviously, we currently have draft alternatives that are out that don't have anything other than these kind of illustrative maps. As part of the scoping report, we'll need to put out alternatives that are more detailed, so that we can actually analyze them, but it won't be at that level of, kind of block by block where are the lines drawn, but rather it will be kind of areas so we can kind of show how that growth might be generally distributed. But then as we get to a final per alternative, we actually will have zoning maps that will have, which will be very detailed and will have heights and proposed development regulations by block or by site. And so the preferred alternative will have that level of detail, but the alternatives that will be analyzing for the draft EIS will not.
Thank you, Brennan. We have about 6 questions left. They're similar in terms of housing being the main topic. So one is about how long it would take to change zoning and finally get to building the housing in this process.
Yeah, so we were proposing to have a draft plan, which would include a zoning proposal in April of 2024. So about, you could do the math. And then that would have to go to council. Our hope is that they could adopt it in the end of 2024. It is possible that it might take them to do 2025 to do that. And then, generally there's at least a delay of, a month before things actually, from when it's adopted to when it goes into effect. There may be reasons to have that be longer. And so the new regulations would then be in place, again, late 2024 or early 2025. And any development coming in at that point would be subject to that. And it would still obviously from there take, tends to take about 6 to 12 months to get permitting, and then you have to construct. So, any actual housing that would utilize this will still probably be 5 years off.
Thank you.
I do want to quickly say just two quick things. One is, under this Growth Management Act, we have to have zoning that is consistent with our plan. So, and with this particular plan, we really are trying to bring the code changes and the plan together, forward together. They may actually be adopted at slightly different times, but essentially as one package. That's one thing. The other thing is, really want to emphasize the importance of increasing housing supply and diversity, now. I think this administration, the mayor, is very focused on housing and is interested in boosting supply and stimulating housing production. Before we even get there, there's a housing sub-cabinet that the mayor has convened. Brennan is one of the folks helping to staff that effort. And so the comp plan falls within a larger story of things that the city is trying to do now to increase housing supply. We're not waiting 5 years to get results here. It's the larger context.
Other questions about range of housing. One has to do with making sure there's more affordable housing for families and not just units designed for single persons, such as in the U district. Another take on range is if the city has a $1 million average home price, how can the housing options help move the average home price? And whether there's been any models for housing used elsewhere in the world that's proven.
Great. Yeah, so first on the first one, yeah, thanks for the comment. I think, certainly increasingly diversity of housing supply is definitely one of the goals of the update to the growth strategy and the comprehensive plan generally. I think we certainly want to achieve a variety of unit sizes and types and things for families as well as smaller households. So because the second one, I guess, is about the average price. I see that from the question that it's a little bit like, what do we think that we could actually hope to achieve? Obviously we've seen historic increases in prices. Again, over the last 10 years, the average price after adjusting for inflation has doubled. So nothing that we're going to do is going to bring us back to an olden days in which housing was super cheap. But at the same time, things can get a lot worse. And so, I think that we certainly don't have a goal for what we'd like the housing price to be, except less, and probably slowing the increases may be might be a reasonable goal as well. And so, but in terms of looking at things that worked in other parts of the world, yeah, there's an amazing diversity of approaches. I think Japan is a great example. Tokyo is one of the densest cities in the world and has housing prices that are substantially below Seattle's by a large margin. And it appears that a lot of that just has to do with the supply of housing that they have been able to do, and specifically allowing kind of density housing over a wide variety of areas. I think in Europe, especially like Austria, have a really good example of really strong funding for affordable housing at a national level that has allowed to create a lot more kind of subsidized housing. And I think there's a lot of other examples that kind of do those two things together. But I think primarily it is allowing a lot more housing and a more diversity of housing, as well as more public funding of housing as well.
And Brendan, if I could, that was all great stuff. We're not proposing a profile of the city of Seattle that looks like Tokyo. I want to be. Tokyo's great. Don't get me wrong. But that's obviously a very different context in terms of the density and scale. But it's a nice example of where supply and cost, I have some relationship that's really has a long track record. But I think that there are other examples closer to home. We're really watching what's happening in other cities in the US that have identified and implemented new ways to allow especially some of that middle density housing, new types of housing that provide ownership options, that open up neighborhoods that are relatively, haven't been growing their housing stock very much. Portland is one. Some interesting results out of the zoning changes they put in place, and there are others as well. And there's a really growing body of literature, which I think really does show that there's a strong relationship between supply and overall cost. Brennan is right, though. We're not going to return to where prices were, especially for single family detached on their own individual 5,000 square foot lot. That's not the intent here, but rather to provide both more supply to mitigate the intense competition for people to be able to live in the city and driving up prices where only the people have a lot of money prevail in getting the housing, and provide types of housing that are in short supply now. Smaller units, medium-sized units, townhomes, different types of housing that can be purchased, but is an alternative to the detached large single-family home. So it's both creating housing types that cost less and providing enough housing so that the overall market pressure goes down. That's the theory here, and there's a lot of evidence that backs up that those tools work over the long run. And this is a long-range plan. That's really what we're doing here, setting us up for a more equitable and affordable future.
Thank you. Some related permit process questions, concern about SDCI, Seattle Department of Construction. Maybe going quickly and maybe dispensing with environmental or social issues and wanting that department to follow the comprehensive plan decisions.
Great, yes. Well, so we do work closely with SDCI. We actually have a work group that I'm meeting monthly with them to discuss various topics. Yeah, I can't discuss their website. I don't know where specifically you think the comprehensive plan decisions they're not following, but yes, the comprehensive plan, there is a requirement that our development regulations align with the comprehensive plan, and so we'll continue to make sure that that is occurring.
Thank you. So another couple questions have to do with development near transit. Or being walkable. So one is about what about development at existing transit stops like Northgate? Another one asks about whether comprehensive neighborhoods are equivalent to a 15-minute neighborhood. Is that achievable in those alternatives 2 and 3?
Brennan, I'll give you a break on your voice and maybe we could tag team the other way around. I appreciate that the question really identifies Northgate there, because one of the things that we want to be really clear about is that the urban centers, and Northgate is an urban center, it's regionally designated, it's one of in our plan, currently is expected to take a good share of the city's growth, and in a denser mix of uses. We have a new light rail station there. There's a lot of great opportunity there. Obviously, Northgate is changing as we speak and toward becoming that new kind of place. Those centers like Northgate and the U District and downtown, Capitol Hill, First Hill, others, and our urban villages, throughout the city are going to continue to be centerpieces of our growth strategy in all of these alternatives. So you're going to see that in this plan, regardless of which alternative we choose or at the end of the day. We also, as another body of work that our office is doing, is looking at station area planning needs around some of our new light rail stations. The West Seattle Ballard line, for example, 14 new stations are going to be coming online. Some of those are within our existing centers and villages, some are in new locations. So we're working closely with that team to align the growth strategy with those opportunities as well. And now I'm forgetting the second question. There was a part 2 of that question. Brennan, maybe you take that part.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the complete neighborhoods and 15-minute neighborhoods are essentially different ways of saying the same thing. That basically neighborhoods in which people can meet their everyday needs within a short walk or bike of their house. And so obviously that is a kind of a principle that we want to try and consider and see how that we can, the comprehensive plan can create more 15-minute or complete neighborhoods. As to whether any of the alternatives will achieve that, I think it is. It's more like a principle rather than a yes or no, and so I don't think we have. We're not certainly proposing to create like a metric that would say, this would be a complete neighborhood or this wouldn't be a complete neighborhood. But the goal is to help create more complete neighborhoods across the city.
Thank you. Here's a question for Patrice about whether the zoning process for 130th and 145th is moving faster than the rest of One Seattle comprehensive plan.
It's actually moving along the same timeline. So when the comprehensive plan is adopted, there may be some zoning proposals associated with citywide changes, and then we would also bring forward more specific changes for the areas in that station area. And the reason for doing that is because there's some citywide changes that will affect that station area. And so it really makes sense to kind of bring those forward and do them together. We thought about trying to do the station area plan more quickly, but we wanted to avoid a situation where there would be like two sets of zoning regulations that would apply to the areas. So we decided to bring them forward together.
Thank you. As we close in on our final questions, we have one here noting Spokane having voted to approve duplex, triplex, fourplex on single family lots. If they can do it, can't Seattle?
I guess the answer is we can. Obviously, we can't vote anything yesterday, but that, one of the alternatives does specifically look at allowing more housing types like triplexes and fourplexes across all neighborhoods. That would be probably very similar to what Spokane proposed. Obviously, that is just one of the alternatives we're studying, but the final one could include that.
Thank you. Looks like our final question here on Northgate, why is there a lag in housing development given the need for housing?
Yeah, so I assume this is kind of a question about what's happened there in the past. Obviously, we don't own the land in Northgate, so we can't make development happen there. Rather, we can set the table, provide incentives, work with partner agencies. Obviously, like the King County owns a site there that we've been working very closely to get development on. So I think through zoning we set the table, but it is true that the market also has to be there for the property owners to actually step in and choose to develop. Northgate is obviously a very complicated place, so I won't go into the specifics of it. But that without ownership, we have to set the table, and the market will ultimately make the decision about what happens there.
Thank you, Brennan. One more for Patrice, back to the station area and the relationship to Seattle's work to adjacent city of Shoreline, like shared streets and things like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on up there, and the city does coordinate with Shoreline in terms of some of the corridor improvements, and then also it's a state highway, and Sound Transit is building this BRT line. But in terms of the land use, yeah, we talk to the planners at Shoreline pretty frequently. Actually, we're going to check in with them again because they did their rezoning about 6 or 7 years ago. And although they have seen a lot of townhouse development far from the station, they haven't really seen a lot of development at the station. And now they are. And so, we're going to check in with them and see what they're hearing from the development community and what modifications they might have made to make those developments work. So we can learn a lot. They're a little bit ahead of us in line. So we definitely want to learn from their experience.
Great, Brennan, that does it for open questions.
Great, well, thank you very much for attending and posting questions. If additional questions come up, you're welcome to email me, brennan.staley@seattle.gov. Please do take some time to consider the materials that are online. Obviously, we have the story map, a fact sheet. We have more information on the metrics we're proposing to analyze around equity and climate. And we are looking for comments by August 22nd. Obviously, and again, those can come to the One Seattle Engagement Hub or by email or mail to myself. So thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it. Obviously, this is really to the beginning of a long process, and we're going to be looking for a lot of feedback, not just on the EIS process, but on and developing the draft plan, the final plan, and the zoning recommendations. So I encourage you to kind of continue to be involved. And if you have not already, sign up for the mailing list on our website so you can continue to get information about the program as it moves forward. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.